Grief always involves a sense of tragedy. However, when the loss you are mourning is a loss from suicide, it not only involves tragedy, but it involves trauma and shock. Today we're going to explore how the loss of a suicide death is different from other losses. This video is dedicated to Suicide Prevention and Awareness Month. 1 in 4 people have been impacted by a loss through suicide. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications bell so you will know when I post the next video. In my next video, I'm going to discuss how to begin to process the loss through suicide in your life. For many years in my career, I was able to work with people who were at very high risk of death by suicide. Many have lived and some have died through suicide. This is a passionate and personal dedication for me. I have lost clients, I have lost colleagues, I have lost friends, and I have lost friends' children through the thoughts and the acts of suicide. This is not just a concept for me. For you, it may well be a concept, and we all think that that's true until it's no longer a concept for us. This is a real crisis of grief. Please put a heart in the comments below if you have lost a loved one, a friend, an acquaintance, or a colleague through the act of suicide. We need to be real about how common this experience is. So how does loss by suicide differ from other types of loss? Grief always involves a sense of tragedy, but when that loss comes from a death by suicide, it always involves a sense of trauma as well. That sense of trauma can come from the suddenness of the death. It can come from the nature and the violence involved in the death. It can come from you having been the one to have found your loved one who has now died by suicide. It can come from the sense of preventability. It can come from the sense of culpability, as though you had something to do with their death. It can come from the shattering belief that love alone will save the soul of the person who we cared about. So number 2 reason why grief from a suicide is different is that grief can generally be predicted to follow some certain stages and patterns. Please see my video where I discuss my humble theory around grief stages and phases. What's different about grief from a suicide loss, however, is that the acute grief stage can stay. And not only can it stay and get stuck, but the symptoms of the acute grief phase can also increase in dimension, it can increase in severity, and it can increase in duration. It also increases in the permanent impacts on someone's life. The third way that grief from a suicide loss is different is that one of the tasks of grief is for us to try to understand or to develop a sense of meaning in our grief. When the loss has been through suicide, most people find it much more challenging to begin to make sense of the death. This can leave us questioning and floundering for a much longer period of time, with stronger implications for our grief in our future, and it can begin to impair how we see relationships and how we begin to find our place in the world. This is the perfect environment for complicated grief to develop. The fourth reason why this is a different kind of loss when suicide is involved is that guilt is a natural product. Please see this video here that I made about this. However, when the death is by suicide, the invitation to guilt is largely magnified. It is often accompanied by anger and shame and helplessness and rejection and abandonment. The feelings are big. If the history or the experience of our loved one's suicide thoughts and actions is lengthy, then there's also something called the relief effect. And what that speaks to is the fact that when someone we love has been practicing or rehearsing or threatening suicide, then the questions that it brings us is, will this happen? How will this happen? When will this happen? And there can be a certain sense of relief once we know the answers to all of those pressing questions. This is a massive invitation to guilt when someone that you care about has died by suicide. And it's important to note that this is a very real effect. Reason number 5. When the death is by age or illness or accident, nobody is questioning the ethics or the morals or the connectedness in that person's death. However, when the death is from suicide, it is an invitation again to stigma and blame and fear. Cultural, religious, and ethnic biases all play a role here. Death by suicide invites in all of these questions and these dimensions. It makes our grief that much more difficult to navigate. This can become a social nightmare to respond to. It often divides families as well. When they have a shared grief to support and process, they are often being divisive, judging, blaming, and accusing. And they no longer are sharing the grief, they're sharing the anger. Issue number 6 that I offer up as to why loss by suicide is profoundly different is that it then challenges all of the boundaries of privacy. If the death by suicide has occurred in a home, this then becomes a crime scene. It's not only a crime scene, but an investigation then ensues. And everybody who lives in that home or was home at the time then becomes a suspect. They become interrogated in terms of their role in the death, potentially, and they need to answer questions. This is a terrible trajectory from a loss by suicide when you're already being questioned about your role in it. Loss from age or illness and accidents do not necessarily start in this place, but a death by suicide, understandably, needs to be investigated, and people then need to be eliminated as suspects. This is such a different starting place for our grief, and it does set the trajectory to invite in guilt and responsibility and culpability. The final issue that I want to offer up that separates grief from a suicide loss as different from other losses is the issue of relatability. None of us want to embrace the concept of death, and loss from illness or accident or aging seems somehow understandable or comprehensible in our lives. However, when the death comes from a suicide, this seems so far removed from our own personal lived experience, until it's not, that we look for ways to be able to say, oh, that wouldn't happen to me. That's not possible in my life. What this means is that often those who are grieving a death of suicide find themselves facing questions such as, did you know that this was possible? Was this the first time? How did they do it? These questions are meant to comfort those distant from the grief, but they compound the grieving experience of those close to the person who has just died. It leads to many, many insensitive questions so that those who are needing those answers can feel like it wouldn't happen to them. It's like the great divide. But I'm here to tell you that's a false belief. If 1 in 4 people have been touched by the death of suicide, then we need to be more accountable, more open, and more supportive, and not think that that always happens to other people. If you have found this video helpful, please like it with the thumbs up down below so that YouTube will know to share it broadly to others who might be searching and struggling with how to navigate loss from suicide. Please be sure to turn on the notifications so that you'll know when I post my next video, where we do discuss how to navigate your loss from a suicide. This is an intense topic that we have covered today, and I've only covered some aspects of the difference between the loss from suicide. And I know that our community who is working at doing grief differently may have some other things to add, so please comment below if you've anything to add to this video. If speaking about the loss through suicide today has been triggering for you, please contact your local crisis services. Please reach out to support services, and know that if you're in Canada, I have included in the comments below some links where you would be able to access some immediate crisis support. If grief from suicide has touched your life in any way, then I extend to you kind thoughts, kind words, and a kind heart. Take good care, and I'll see you again.